With just slight change of program, I'm going to speak about my topic first. It was going to be sort of like the light relief after some really solid information from John, but we've got some IT problems, which I perhaps jinxed, I don't know. So I'm talking about native fish in the Finke River and what that can tell us about salinity and what that can tell us about salt as a water quality issue for cattle. The reason I'm talking about this is because I did fish surveys in the Finke and other rivers for about 10 years. It was kind of like my dream job, and I loved it. I started my working life in agriculture and forestry, and then I moved into the environment field, and yeah, perhaps it wasn't going to get any better than that job. So when I needed to do something new, I've come back to agriculture, which I'm loving. But yeah, that's the background story for me and fish and cattle and salt. So I just need to work out how to drive this, which I'm sure is going to be really easy.
It should just work the arrows.
Yeah, but they're not. Switched off. Has it got a button?
We need to...
Okay, so I'll just give you some more background.
We should be on now.
Okay, yay. So yeah, I got to go to a lot of amazing places and see great things. So that's why, one of the reasons it was my dream job. That's a waterhole up on the Sandover, most of the time very fresh water. And that's a fish, because there's fish in this talk, native fish that can tolerate a bit of salt in the water, but not a lot. People, and you know, this job, every job that I do is as much about people as anything. So fish survey is about people, and I'll talk a bit more about that, but I just love that photo. To me, it illustrates how important working with nature and living with animals is for us to thrive as humans. So it's a bit of a digression from, and that I'm getting back to the Finke River now. So there's 9 different species. I've got 8 of them there. Somebody clever might tell us what's missing. And just threw in a bit about plants, because I'm a bit of a plant geek. I worked over here at the Desert Park for 4 years in the herbarium as a botanist and as a wetland scientist. But to be fair to the botanists of the world, I was probably a wetland scientist doing botany rather than a hardcore botanist. And there's a couple of pretty rare-ish plants that live in the Finke River. And yeah, I was really grateful for the opportunity to be the first person doing some of that survey work down the Finke, which is amazing when you think about it. We found a lot of new stuff, which was really interesting. But I'll sort of move away from that more into the cattle and the salt world soon. That's just showing where that river sits in the territory and the greater Lake Eyre Basin. So yeah, what does people might think that talking about fish is getting a bit off topic at a beef up? So first thing is the Finke River is a really salty river. Not all the waterholes are salty, but a lot of them are really salty, and the Aranda name is Larapinta or Larapinta, which means salty river. So it's a bit of a clue. There's a lot of salt there. That's on the Palmer River catchment. That's a salty waterhole upstream of a rock bar with groundwater coming out, and that groundwater is not particularly salty, but when it's coming out constantly and evaporating, you get a lot of salt on the surface. And that's the process that is bringing salt into the landscape, into the river, into your bores. If you've got salty bores, it's rocks, ancient rocks underground, which have got a salt content, and as water moves through it, if it's an aquifer, it picks up salt and it comes to the surface. Electroconductivity is a measurement of salinity, and we'll come back to that, but I just wanted to, this is a bar chart showing how much salt was in the water at a whole lot of waterholes we sampled in 1 week on the Finke. This line here is about seawater quality, so you can see that we had waterholes more salty than water. On that occasion, this is the level at which the saltiest pool we found fish in, and you're not going to see cattle drinking in those ones, that's for sure. I'll come back to this in a bit more detail, but this is about the level below which cattle will be able to get some benefit from the water, and above, they're better off not drinking it. And down here is sort of roughly the level at which humans are not going to really be happy drinking the water if it's saltier than that. Most of the Finke River is on pastoral land, so doing surveys on Finke River for fish, it means also you're seeing a lot of things that cattle are doing. Cattle are a big part of the landscape, and the water is really important to them, and what they're doing is important to things in the water. There's cattle, I just talked about that. And yeah, I spent a lot of time talking to pastoralists, probably not as much as would have been good because they got a lot of knowledge. That's Ross Morton at Hembury, who was there for a long time and had talked to the people before him, so talking to him taught me a lot about what was happening. That's Bob Reed, who he's in Tasmania now with freshwater, but he worked up here as a hydrogeologist, working out where to drill for water bores for a long time. So talking to those guys taught me a lot because they think in 3 dimensions about what's happening under the ground, which is hard for most of us. Getting back to the fish just very quickly, these guys thrive on low salinity water, so fresh water, but also running water and springs. That's a spring running in a creek bed. That's of interest to everyone. If you've got cattle and there's a spring, you've got constantly fresh water coming out, it's going to be clean, but also good for some species of fish. At the other end of the spectrum, these are the guys who can live in those water holes saltier than seawater, and got a bit of goby caviar on a rock. You're probably going to have to work hard to get a feed out of that, but those guys also only really thrive when it's salty water. So they actually love the salty water. I started my working sort of professional career in computer modelling, and I've left it well behind. That's about as close as I can get to a computer model now. That is my depiction of the Finke River. And the pistachios are the salty water holes, the tomatoes are the permanent freshwater holes, and the green peas are the sort of all the rest. So some people like to think in pictures, so you might remember that more than anything else. So just recapping, huge variation in salinity down the Finke. Some water holes stay fresh, some go from fresh to salty, some are pretty much always salty. Groundwater is really important. So quick, this is a lead into what John will talk about. How much salt is there in that water? So my text there is really small, sorry, it didn't work out. But the one way you work it out, and that's the most accurate way, is just to evaporate off the water. You weigh how much you had at the start of water and how much at the end, and that's your total dissolved solids or total dissolved salts. It's really accurate, it's not quick, and you can measure that as parts per million, which is the same as milligrams per litre, or as parts per thousands, it's grams a litre. So I'm just sort of stepping us into how do you measure this stuff. I'm not expecting everyone, this is not going to be a test, but if you really need to, if you have a situation where you need to understand what your water quality is from a salt perspective, you have to know that you can go and look this up. I still go and look up the cheat sheet to remember which units are what. So you don't have to have it all locked in your head, but you have to know it's there. The other method is conductivity, which is quick. So you measure how well that water is carrying an electrical current. And the more salt there is, the more easily it conducts. So the higher the conductivity. And that has, you can just call it EC, which is electrical conductivity units, or microsiemens per centimetre, or millisiemens per centimetre. And that gets confusing because there's order of 1,000 difference between those two units. So if you don't know which units you're talking about, you've got no idea what that data means. And same confusion that you might get with most people talk parts per million, but occasionally you'll see data in parts per thousand. 1,000 factor difference, so you have to know what it is. I'm probably going way over time, but I just check in, is that good that I'm going over time or bad that I'm going over time?
It's good. Well, we've got technical issues. So.
Okay. Right, so again, very small text. I'm sorry about that, but I've got some sort of reference examples. Alice Springs tap water, which I love. It's about 800 parts per million. And down at that fresher low end, parts per million and conductivity unit numbers look very similar because it's almost a one-to-one relationship. They start close and then they diverge. So 770 microsiemens, we'll just call it EC. And I think that water tastes great. Unpleasant for most people, you get up to 1,200 parts per million, which is getting close to, 1,200 parts per million, getting close to 2,000 EC units. You'll be able to drink that and it'll keep you alive pretty well, but it'll taste crap, unless you grew up at Ormiston, because they have crap water. A teaspoon of salt in a litre, I thought that was a good sort of reference. A teaspoon is about 6 grams. So that's 6,000 parts per million. So 6 grams is 6,000 milligrams. So put that in a litre of water, it's 6,000 parts per million. Toxicity for people, I couldn't, it's hard to actually find the exact number, but it's, depending on what the different salts are in the water, it might be bad for you sooner at a lower level, because the main salt that we're worried about, the main component in salinity for cattle and people is the sodium, and it's the one you hear about for your heart disease and your blood pressure. But there's a heap of other salts, your calcium, your magnesium, your carbonates, your sulfates. So toxic for people, there is an upper limit just based on if it's really, really salty and you're drinking it and that's going into your bloodstream, it gets to the point that the saltiness in your blood is sucking water out of your cells, and then your cells collapse and you die. And that's roughly around 9,000. And we'll come to what cattle on my next slide. Seawater, 35,000 parts per million, and at this point we've digressed those two curves have digressed, and that's roughly 53,000 conductivity units. But if you were talking in millisiemens per centimetre rather than microsiemens, that would only be 53. So that's where if you're saying, oh, that number's 53, that's fine, that's fresher than Alice Springs water, but you're talking the wrong unit, you've got no idea what that data tells you or what your friend's talking about. So you have to know what units you're in once you start engaging with this in terms of trying to understand things. Waterholes with fish, we've seen them over 80,000 microsiemens, which is double, not quite double, but getting on for double seawater, but yet that's rare. Mostly the fish, even the salt-loving ones, are happy up to around seawater and above. They're probably thriving below that. And those salt-loving ones, since I'm digressing back into my love of fish and waterholes, those salt-loving fish, they'll live in fresh water, but they're then competing with all the other fish. And so that's why they do best in the salty water, because they're adapted for it and the other guys aren't. So getting on to cattle, which is really what today's all about, of course. So good water for cattle, around about 4,000 parts per million. And I think we'll probably hear some quite different stories about that when we start hearing about work in feedlots where they wouldn't want that water. But for us, if we were getting a new bore we'd be pretty happy to get any water quality for salt below 4,000 parts per million. There's quite a lot of different ag fact sheets from different states. How are we going for time now?
That was your cue.
That's my cue to speed up. So I just got to the good bit. I'll speed through it. That's all right, because it's, you know, you can get this off me later if it's something that's relevant to you. I'll just step through it. I talked to a lot of people, talked to Chris Matern about this, talked to Neil MacDonald, who was a researcher and manager in our ag world. And I read a whole lot of ag sheets. Once moderate quality would be between 5,000 and 8,000. I'm just going to give you the parts per million on the left. I talked to John Mashusen, hydrogeologist. He said the NT driller's rule of thumb is around 7,000 to 8,000. Yeah, if you get water under that for a stock boil, that's okay. Again, below 4,000 is going to be better. And just remember, 4,000 for people is terrible. It's not good for your health, but you could survive on it. So cattle can tolerate water. Beef cattle can tolerate much more salt than we can. Only drinking occasionally, 10,000. But in fact, I've seen a lot of cattle living on waterholes at that level. So what occasionally is, this is where we're getting to the point where I don't have access to the data that tells you the details. And there may be people who can, but I haven't met them yet. Absolute upper limit, we're not sure, but it's going to be higher than 10,000, and it might be up to 15,000. Okay, and things to consider in terms of how this might affect your business or use of, so we know some stations have good paddocks with salty water. If there's green feed, they can tolerate that salty water a lot better. So if there's an option if you've got any sort of rotation or spelling type program, getting the animals in there when the feed's green might be a better option. What the animals are used to, so yeah, that just makes sense. That's my Adelaide drinking water story. If they're lactating, they've got lower tolerance for salt in the water. If it's hot weather, they've got lower tolerance. It's going to be more harmful, or their production is going to be worse when it's salty water. So again, if you've got any rotation factor going on, that might be winter is the time, or if there's late rain or autumn, that sort of thing. You might limit the time on the more saline bores. Some minerals like magnesium could be problematic for things like scouring, but mainly it's just how much sodium there is, which you can measure with. Sodium is so dominant, sodium chloride, that a simple measure of parts per million or conductivity gives you a pretty good indication. And we're pretty much close to the end. I had a little story. The cows know where the fresh water is. That's what that one is. I won't go into it since we're over time. But yeah, it was amazing. One was getting very heavily used by cattle. Why they're so different in salt so close together is just like one of those fascinating stories which might be more interesting to me than you, and we don't really know. But the one next door, salty, cattle could have drunk it. They would have drunk there if they didn't have a much better option close by. They always know where the better water is. And absolutely full of fish, 5 species of fish in this little waterhole here. So we called that one Lucky Strike because we were fish geeks looking for fish. Just more pictures of us working with water. Golden goby in the Georgina, which is a fantastic little fish. And my takeaways, which we've pretty much covered. Understanding salt content. Check your units. If you come back in next week, next month, next year, just have a little reference sheet for the unit so that you're not confused. It's not too hard, but I have to keep checking. If you want to know more about your bores, there's people in the government you can talk to. There's an online system where you can look it up and find out what the salinity was when it was drilled. They can change, but probably not that much, not like the water holes. And if you want to get a sample tested, you can bring it in and we can test it. That's pretty easy. We'll hear from other speakers, but my understanding is no easy way to take salt, no cheap or affordable way to take the salt out. So that might be a bad news story. So there's management possibilities and there's research possibilities and priorities. That's me.
Perfect. And we are going to go straight to Janelle Wilkes.
Okay.
And so I will set that up for you. Thank you very much, Angus.